In a weathered farmhouse at the edge of Prairie Falls, Montana, time stands still for James MacPherson. For 20 years, he's lived alone with his memories. The creaking floorboards, his only companion since his daughter moved away. The silver in his temples marks not just age, but the quiet battles of raising a child alone, of losing everything except his dignity and this old house his grandfather built. Tonight, as thunder rattles the windows and rain lashes against worn shutters, a knock echoes through the darkness. On his porch stands an elegant woman, drenched and lost, her expensive car broken down on the muddy road. What neither of them knows is how this stormy night will change both their lives forever. Could this chance encounter heal two hearts that stopped believing in second chances? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in James's entryway hadn't missed a beat in 43 years. Its steady rhythm echoed through the empty rooms of the MacPherson farmhouse, marking time with the same reliability his own father had shown working these Montana fields. Some nights, like this one, its ticking was both comfort and curse, a reminder that life moved forward, even when you'd rather it stood still. James settled into his father's old leather armchair, worn smooth by generations of MacPherson men. Through the window, sheets of rain transformed his carefully tended garden into a blur of shadow and motion. The storm had rolled in from the north, bringing with it the kind of darkness that made a man question his place in the world. He reached for the wooden box on the side table, his calloused fingers tracing the familiar grain of the walnut lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay Marian's wedding ring. 22 years had passed since he'd last seen it on her finger, since that terrible morning when their dreams of growing old together shattered in a hospital delivery room. The ring caught the lamplight, gold still bright against the deep. Burgundy velvet, untarnished by time. The doctors had called it a miracle that Sarah survived. For months after, he'd wandered the house like a ghost, cradling his newborn daughter, while grief and joy waged war in his heart. The construction business he'd built from the ground up began to slip, contracts missed, deadlines forgotten. If it hadn't been for Sarah's first smile, her tiny fingers gripping his thumb with surprising strength, he might have lost himself completely. Those early years blurred together in his memory. Midnight feedings, first steps, financial juggling that would have made a circus performer proud. He'd sold off parcels of the family land, piece by piece, to keep them afloat. Each sale felt like trading away a piece of his heritage, but Sarah needed new shoes, school supplies, a chance at the future Marian had dreamed of for their child. The old house creaked around him, settling into the storm like an elderly dog. Finding its favorite spot, James glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. Sarah would be asleep in Seattle now, probably curled up next to that husband of hers, David or Daniel. The boy seemed nice enough, but James could never quite remember his name. They'd invited him to move closer, offered to help him find a place in the city. But the thought of leaving this house, these memories, felt like betraying something essential about himself. His fingers found the small notepad he kept by the chair, filled with calculations and recalculations of his dwindling savings. Pride had kept him from telling Sarah about the mortgage troubles. The bank's latest letter lay unopened. On the kitchen counter, its presence an accusation. 30 years of hard work, of honest living, and all he had to show for it was a house he could barely afford and memories that cut like broken glass. Thunder cracked overhead, and the lights flickered once, twice, before steadying. James closed the ring box with gentle reverence, returning it to its place beside the lamp. The storm was getting worse. He ought to check the generator, make sure it was ready if the power went out. At his age, he should be settled, secure, not wondering if each month would be the one when the bank finally ran out of patience. He pushed himself up from the chair, joints protesting the movement. The hardwood floors, installed by his own hands when Sarah was still in elementary school, creaked beneath his feet. Each board held a memory. Sarah practicing dance steps in sock feet, the Christmas morning she'd slid across the floor in her new pajamas, the quiet afternoons when he'd taught her to read while summer light streamed through the windows. The house had grown too big for one person, but its walls held the story of his life. Even empty, these rooms echoed with the ghosts of laughter, of tears, of all the small moments that made up a family's history. He'd learned to live with the silence, to find comfort in routine and purpose in the daily tasks of keeping the old place standing. Above the mantel, Sarah's high school graduation photo smiled down at him. She'd been so eager to leave, to chase her dreams in the big city. He'd stood in this same spot the day she drove away, watching until her taillights disappeared around the bend, proud and heartbroken in equal measure. Now their conversations had dwindled to brief Sunday phone calls and the occasional holiday visit. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a thunderclap that rattled the windows in their frames. And then, cutting through the storm's fury, came a sound that didn't belong. 3 sharp knocks on his front door. The graduation photo above the mantel caught another flash of lightning, Sarah's frozen smile seeming to flicker with life for just a moment. James often found himself studying that image, trying to pinpoint exactly when his little girl had transformed into the poised young woman in the cap and gown. The frame held more than just a photograph. It captured the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, though he hadn't fully understood that at the time. He remembered the morning of that photo with painful clarity. Sarah had insisted on wearing her mother's pearl earrings, the ones James had kept wrapped in tissue paper in his dresser drawer. She'd stood before the mirror, touching them gently, her resemblance to Marion so striking it had stolen his breath. "Dad," she'd said, voice trembling slightly, "do you think Mom would be proud?" The question had caught in his throat like a fishbone. He'd spent 18 years trying to be both father and mother, never quite sure if he was doing either role justice. Every decision had felt like walking a tightrope, when to push, when to comfort, when to let her fall and learn to pick herself up again. There had been triumphs, her first solo in the school choir, the academic scholarships that started arriving. In their mailbox, the way she'd learned to cook Marion's recipes by his side, each of them adding their own touches until they'd created something new from the memories. But there had been failures too, moments when his best hadn't been enough. The father-daughter dance he'd fumbled through at her middle school formal, the time he'd missed her debate championship because a construction job ran late, the countless times he'd seen questions in her eyes that only a mother could properly answer. The local paper had run a story about Sarah's graduation. Valedictorian, full ride to the University of Washington, daughter of local contractor James MacPherson. The article had mentioned Marion too, a brief line about the widow who'd raised such an accomplished daughter. He'd wanted to write to the editor to explain that Marion had done the hard part by giving Sarah life, that his fumbling attempts at parenthood paled in comparison to that sacrifice. Sarah had found him that evening, sitting in the kitchen with the newspaper spread out before him, his coffee long gone cold. She'd wrapped her arms around his shoulders from behind, the way she used to do as a child. "You did good, Dad," she'd whispered, and he'd had to turn away to hide his tears. College had been a slow letting go. Weekly phone calls became monthly, then occasional. She'd met Daniel, yes, that was his name, during her junior year. James had watched their relationship blossom through the filtered lens of video calls and holiday visits. The boy was kind, ambitious, everything he should want for his daughter. But when Sarah announced their engagement, something in James's chest had tightened like a vice. The wedding was in Seattle, an elegant affair that made James acutely aware of his weathered hands and small-town manners. Daniel's family had money, old money that showed in their ease with the world. Sarah glowed that day, every inch the sophisticated city woman she'd become. During their father-daughter dance, she'd whispered, "I wish Mum could see this." He'd held her closer, remembering another dance in a middle school gymnasium, and thought about how love meant learning to let go. They'd asked him to move closer afterward, offered to help him find a place in the city. Sarah had researched condos, sent him listings for small houses in the suburbs. "You could have a fresh start, Dad," she'd said during one of their calls. "Meet new people, maybe even—" She'd stopped there, but he'd understood the unspoken suggestion. 20 years was a long time to be alone, but the thought of leaving the farmhouse felt like abandoning his post. Every nail he'd driven, every board he'd replaced, every room he'd painted, held memories of building a life for Sarah. The garden still bloomed with Marion's favorite flowers, though he'd never quite mastered her touch with roses. The kitchen window still had the height marks penciled on its frame, tracking Sarah's growth from toddler to teenager. Thunder rolled again, closer now, and James found himself moving toward the front door. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out a figure on his porch, hunched against the storm. His hand hesitated on the doorknob, 20 years of solitude warring with a lifetime of Montana hospitality. James opened the door to find a woman in her 50s standing in the rain, her silver-streaked dark hair plastered against her face. Despite her bedraggled appearance, something in her posture spoke of elegance, the kind that couldn't be washed. Away by a storm. In one manicured hand, she clutched a broken car key, its jagged edge catching the porch light. "I'm so sorry to disturb you this late," she said, her voice carrying a hint of embarrassment beneath its cultured tone. "My car. I think I've killed it completely this time. The key snapped off in the ignition, and my cell phone has no service out here." She attempted to brush her wet hair back from her face, a gesture that seemed more habitual than effective. "I saw your lights and took a chance." Lightning illuminated the driveway behind her, where James could make out the shape of a luxury sedan, its dark form out of place against his weather-beaten fence. The woman shivered, and decades of his mother's lessons in hospitality kicked in before he could second-guess himself. "Please, come in," he said, stepping back from the door. "You'll catch your death out there." The phrase echoed in his ears, something his mother used to say, now falling from his own lips like an inherited truth. She hesitated for just a moment before crossing his threshold, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Water dripped from her expensive coat, forming a small puddle at her feet. "I'm Catherine," she offered, trying to maintain dignity while looking like a drowned cat. "Catherine Morgan. I was trying to find the highway when the storm hit." "James MacPherson," he replied, suddenly aware of his worn flannel shirt and the day's worth of stubble on his chin. "Let me get you some towels. The bathroom's through there if you'd like to dry off properly." He gestured toward the hallway, where family photos tracked Sarah's growth along the wall. Catherine's eyes followed his gesture, taking in the photos with quiet interest. "You have a beautiful family," she said softly, and something in her tone made James wonder what stories she carried beneath her polished exterior. "Just me here now," he found himself saying. "My daughter's in Seattle." He disappeared into the linen closet, grateful for the moment to collect himself. When was the last time he'd had a guest in the house? The towels he pulled out were clean but worn, their edges frayed from years of use. When he returned, Catherine had removed her coat, revealing a silk blouse and tailored slacks that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. She accepted the towels with a grateful smile that transformed her face, adding warmth to her elegant features. "I can make some coffee," James offered, "or tea, if you prefer. Might as well wait out the worst of the storm." The grandfather clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the house like a reminder that time hadn't stopped, even if it felt suspended in this strange moment. "Tea would be lovely," Catherine said, following him to the kitchen. She moved with a grace that made his familiar space feel suddenly foreign, as if he were seeing it through her eyes. The chipped coffee mugs in the dish rack, the ancient electric kettle, the calendar on the wall still showing last month's page. As James filled the kettle, Catherine stood by the window watching the storm. "It's beautiful out here," she said, surprising him. "Wild but beautiful, like something out of a story." She turned to face him, still holding his frayed towel. "Thank you for taking in a stranger. Not many would these days. Montana hospitality." He shrugged, but the words felt inadequate. There was something about her presence that made the kitchen feel different, smaller, warmer perhaps. The broken key lay on his counter now, a small token of whatever twist of fate had brought her to his door. "I should call a tow truck," she said, more to herself than to him, "though I suppose that will have to wait until morning." "Roads'll be worse before they're better," James agreed, studying the way the rain traced patterns on the window behind. "Oh, I have a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's dry." The offer surprised him even as he made it, but the thought of sending her back out into the storm seemed impossible now. Catherine's eyes met his, and for a moment they stood in silence, broken only by the kettle's growing whisper and the storm's steady drumming. "Thank you," she said finally, and James heard in those two words an echo of his own loneliness. The old family quilt lay folded over the back of the couch, its pattern of interlocking stars and circles telling stories of 4 generations of MacPherson women. James's grandmother had started it, his mother had finished it, and Marion had restored it the winter before Sarah was born. Now he lifted it carefully, the familiar weight of it in his hands, bringing comfort in this unfamiliar moment. "It's not much," he said, offering the quilt to Catherine, who had settled into the armchair by the fireplace. She'd changed into the clothes he'd found, an old flannel shirt of his and a pair of Sarah's sweatpants left behind from her last visit. The incongruity of her elegant bearing and the casual clothes struck him as both amusing and oddly touching. "It's beautiful," Catherine said, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. "Hand-quilted." When James nodded, she smiled. "My grandmother used to quilt. I still remember the way her fingers moved, like she was playing music only she, could hear. The fire he'd built cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the storm's fury seemed distant now, muted by the warmth of the room and the strange intimacy of sharing memories with a stranger. Their teacups sat on the coffee table, steam rising in lazy spirals. "Did you learn?" James asked, surprising himself with his curiosity. He settled onto the couch, aware of how rarely he sat there. Usually his evenings were spent in his father's. But tonight that felt too solitary, too removed from this unexpected companion. Catherine laughed softly. "She tried to teach me, but I was always too busy planning my escape from our little town in Idaho. I had big dreams, you see, was going to conquer Wall Street." She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, and something in her posture softened. "And I did, for what it's worth. Though sometimes I wonder if Grandma's quilting might have taught me more about life than all those years in boardrooms." "Funny how that works," James mused, watching the fire. "The things we run from when we're young. They have a way of looking different with time." He thought of Sarah, of her eager flight to the city, and wondered if she'd ever feel the pull of home the way he did. "Your daughter," Catherine said, nodding toward the graduation photo. "She lives in the city now." "Seattle. She's got a good life there. Husband, career, everything she dreamed of." He paused, then added, "She wants me to move closer, but this is home," Catherine finished for him, her eyes taking in the room with its layers of history, the worn furniture, the family photos, the marks of time on the walls. "I understand that better than I would have once." Thunder rolled again, but it seemed more distant now. The grandfather clock marked time in its steady way, but the hours felt different somehow, less lonely. Catherine told him about her life in Chicago, about the investment firm she'd built from nothing, about the marriage that had ended in a quiet divorce 3 years ago. "No children?" James asked, then wondered if the question was too personal. "Never seemed to be the right time," she said, but there was an old pain in her voice that he recognized. "Career always came first, until suddenly it didn't seem as important anymore." She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "That's actually why I'm out here, taking some time to reevaluate, I suppose. Though I didn't plan on getting lost in a storm and imposing on strangers." "Not an imposition," James said quietly. It's nice sometimes having someone to talk to besides the clock. Catherine's smile in response held a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They fell into uncomfortable silence, the kind that felt like a conversation of its own. James found himself noticing small details, the way she cradled her tea, cup in both hands, the slight tilt of her head as she studied the photos on his walls, the natural grace with which she wore his old shirt. "Tell me about her," Catherine said suddenly, nodding toward Marian's picture on the mantel. "If you don't." "Mind, she looks like she had a kind smile." James hesitated, surprised by how the request didn't hurt the way it usually did. Perhaps it was the storm, or the lateness of the hour, or something in Catherine's gentle attention, but he found himself wanting to share these memories that he usually kept carefully guarded. "She did," he began, and as the storm raged outside, he told this elegant stranger about the small-town love story that had shaped his life, while the family quilt wrapped her in generations of MacPherson warmth. Morning light filtered through the rain-washed windows, casting pale squares on the kitchen floor where James stood at the stove cooking breakfast. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that seemed somehow cleaner, newer. He'd already been out to check on Catherine's car. The news wasn't good, but he'd wait to tell her. The local newspaper lay unopened on the counter, delivered as always by old Pete Martinez, who'd been running the Prairie Falls Gazette route for 30 years. James hadn't given it much thought until he heard Catherine's soft footsteps entering the kitchen and saw her freeze, her eyes fixed on the paper's front page. There, below the fold, was a photo he might have missed if not for her reaction. Chicago. Business leader takes leave of absence. Catherine Morgan steps down from $2 billion investment firm. The woman in the photograph wore a tailored suit and a confident smile, but her eyes were the same ones that now met his across his worn kitchen counter. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," Catherine said quietly, still wearing his flannel shirt. From the night before, her hair, free from yesterday's rain, framed her face in silver-streaked waves that caught the morning light. "You don't owe me anything," James replied, turning back to the stove where pancakes needed flipping. But questions crowded his mind, pushing against his natural inclination toward privacy. The Catherine Morgan in the newspaper was described as one of Chicago's most influential business leaders, a woman who controlled billion-dollar deals and sat on multiple corporate boards. "I do," she insisted, moving to help him with breakfast as if they'd done this dance 100 times before. "Because last night was the first honest conversation I've had in years, and I'd hate to spoil it with lies of omission." She reached past him for coffee mugs, and the domestic intimacy of the gesture made his heart twist unexpectedly. "The car trouble wasn't a lie," she continued, pouring coffee for them both. "Though I suspect you've already figured out it's beyond repair." When he nodded, she smiled ruefully. "I really was lost. In more ways than one, if I'm being honest." James set plates on the table, his mother's old china that he usually saved for when Sarah visited. "The article says you stepped down 3 months ago," he said carefully, not wanting to pry but needing to understand. Catherine sat, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug as if seeking warmth. "Did you ever wake up one morning and realize you'd built exactly the life you thought you wanted, only to find it was someone else's dream?" She took a sip of coffee, her expression distant. "I spent 30 years building that firm, making all the right moves, playing all the right games. And then my ex-husband remarried, my best friend died of cancer, and suddenly all those quarterly reports and board meetings seemed empty." The morning sun caught the silver in her hair, and James found himself thinking about Marian, about how life had a way of reshaping your understanding of what mattered. "So you just left?" "Not just," she corrected gently. "I spent 6 months planning the transition, making sure my clients and employees would be taken care of. And then I got in my car and started driving, no destination in mind, just following some instinct I couldn't name." James sat across from her, the morning paper between them like a bridge between their worlds. "Until you ended up lost in a Storm in Montana. Until I ended up exactly where I needed to be, she said softly, and the look they shared held echoes of last night's conversations, of shared confidences and unexpected connections. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, and Catherine straightened slightly. I should call my assistant, let her know I'm all right, and arrange for a rental car. She hesitated, then added, unless the roads are still pretty bad, James heard himself saying. Might be safer to wait another day. He wasn't ready to examine why the thought of her leaving made his chest tighten, why this kitchen felt more like home with her in it than it had in years. Catherine's smile held a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Another day. She agreed and reached for the syrup. The newspaper slid to the floor, forgotten for now, while outside his window the morning light painted the wet world in shades of possibility. The old leather tool belt had been a gift from his father the day James started his construction business. Now it hung heavy on his hips as he surveyed the storm damage from his back porch. The rain had torn loose several sections of guttering, and a large branch from the old maple tree had crashed onto the garden fence, crushing Marion's rose trellis. "How bad is it?" Catherine asked from behind him. She'd changed into a pair of Sarah's old jeans and a faded sweatshirt he'd found in the spare room. The CEO from the newspaper article had disappeared entirely, replaced by a woman who looked ready to tackle whatever the morning might bring. "Nothing that can't be fixed," James replied, though his mind was already calculating costs he couldn't really afford. "You don't have to," he began, but Catherine was already rolling up her sleeves. "Show me what to do," she said simply, and something in her voice reminded him of Marion, that same quiet determination that didn't waste time with false modesty or unnecessary protest. He handed her a pair of work gloves, Marion's old ones, still supple after all these years. "Ever worked with tools before?" "I helped my grandfather rebuild his barn one summer," she said, flexing her fingers in the gloves, "though I suspect that knowledge might be a bit rusty." Her smile held a hint of self-deprecation. "But I'm a quick study." They started with the fence, clearing away the fallen branch piece by piece. Catherine proved stronger than she looked, handling the saw with careful precision while James held the larger sections steady. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by occasional instructions or warnings about loose boards. "Hold this end," James said, positioning a replacement post. Catherine stepped closer, her shoulder brushing against his as they aligned the wood. The morning sun had burned away the storm's remnants, leaving behind air that smelled of wet earth and possibility. "You know," Catherine said, holding the post steady while James worked, "I used to dream about this kind of life. Back when I was climbing the corporate ladder, I'd sometimes look out my office window and imagine a place where success was measured in things you could touch. Gardens grown, fences mended, homes built with your own hands." James drove another nail home, considering her words. "It's not always as romantic as it sounds," he said finally. "Sometimes it's just hard work and worry about making ends meet." "I know," she replied softly. "But at least it's real. Do you know what I did last year? I orchestrated a hostile takeover of a family-owned business because their profit margins weren't high enough for our shareholders. The company had been in that family for 3 generations. James watched her face as she spoke, seeing the weight of decisions past in the set of her shoulders. He reached into his tool belt, fingers finding the smooth handle of his father's hammer by instinct. "What happened to them?" "The family. I made sure they were compensated fairly," she said, but her voice held no pride in it. "Set up a generous severance package. Did everything by the book." She laughed, a sound without humor. "The board congratulated me on my humanitarian approach." They moved on to the rose trellis, carefully untangling Marion's climbing roses from the broken lattice. James showed her how to check which stems could be saved, which needed to be cut back to give the plant a chance at recovery. "Marion loved these roses," he found himself saying as they worked. "Used to say they were like people. Sometimes the ones that got knocked down came back stronger as long as you gave them the right support. Catherine's hands stilled on the roses. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. James straightened, feeling the familiar ache in his back. Would you look at that? We've nearly finished. They stood back to survey their work. The fence was straight again, the trellis rebuilt and waiting for spring growth. Catherine had a smudge of dirt on her cheek and sawdust in her hair, but her eyes were bright with satisfaction. "We make a good team," she said, and the simple truth of it hung in the air between them. James was suddenly acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd worked alongside someone who felt like a partner rather than a helper. The tool belt seemed lighter now as he gathered their equipment. Catherine lingered by the roses, gently, touching a surviving bud. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for letting me help, for letting me feel useful again." James understood then that they'd built more than just a fence that morning. In the simple act of working together, they'd begun to bridge the gap between their worlds. One nail, one rose, one shared moment at a time. Evening found them in the living room, a dusty photo album open between them on the coffee table. They'd spent the afternoon cleaning up the last of the storm damage, and now, with muscles pleasantly tired and the satisfaction of work well done, they'd fallen into the kind of conversation that seems to flow more easily in the gentle light of dusk. "I haven't looked at these in years," James admitted, carefully turning a page filled with snapshots from his early days in construction. Sarah used to love hearing the stories behind each picture, but nowadays, time has a way of rushing. "In past," Catherine finished, leaning closer to study a photo of a much younger James standing proudly in front of his first completed house. Her shoulder brushed against his, and neither moved away. "Look at that swagger," she teased gently, tapping the photo. "You were quite sure of yourself back then." James chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. "Had to be. Nobody wants to hire a contractor who seems uncertain. That house, though," he shook his head, "everything that could go wrong did. Foundation issues, permit problems, weather delays, but I was too stubborn to quit." "What happened to it?" Catherine asked, her finger tracing the outline of the house in the photograph, still standing. "The Williams family lives there now. Their grandson just started high school." He turned another page, and there was Marion, pregnant with Sarah, painting the nursery walls. She insisted on doing it herself, even though the doctor told her to take it easy. Said our daughter needed to know her mother was stubborn too. Catherine's hand covered his for a moment, warm and steady. "Tell me about her. Not just how you lost her, but how you found each other." The request surprised him, but not unpleasantly. Most people avoided mentioning Marion, as if speaking of her might shatter some careful balance. But Catherine's question held no pity, only genuine interest. "We met at a hardware store, if you can believe it," he said, smiling at the memory. "She was trying to fix a leaky faucet in her father's house, and I was just starting out in construction. She had this list of parts that made no sense at all, but she was so determined to figure it out herself." "Did you rescue her?" Catherine asked, her eyes twinkling. "Ha! No, she rescued me. Turned out she was a mechanical engineer, just playing along to see if I'd talk down to her. Ended up teaching me a better way to fix the problem." He turned another page, finding a photo of their wedding day. "She always said the best partnerships were built on mutual respect and the ability to laugh at yourself." Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying the wedding photo. "My marriage wasn't like that," she said finally. "Richard and I, we were more like business partners who happened to share a bed. Everything was measured, calculated, part of some grand plan for success." She sighed. "We had separate photo albums, can you imagine? His publicity shots, my corporate events, everything carefully curated for maximum impact." James watched her face as she spoke, seeing the years of loneliness beneath her composed expression. "And now? Now I have a storage unit full of awards and press clippings, and not a single photo that captures a real moment of joy." She smiled, but it held a touch of sadness. "Though I do have one picture I keep in my wallet. Would you like to see it?" She pulled out a worn photograph, creased from frequent handling. It showed a young Catherine, maybe 12, sitting on a porch swing with an elderly man. Both were laughing, their faces lit with genuine happiness. "My grandfather," she explained. "The one who taught me about barn building and what real work feels like. This was the summer before he died." She carefully returned the photo to her wallet. "Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of all the choices I made after he was gone." "I think," James said slowly, "he'd be proud that you're finally listening to your heart instead of your shareholders." Their eyes met over the photo album, and something shifted in the space between them. Catherine's hand found his again, and this time neither pulled away. Outside, the last light of day painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, while inside, the grandfather clock marked time with gentle patience. "Your turn," Catherine said softly, turning back to the album. "Tell me about this one." She pointed to a photo of James teaching a young Sarah to ride a bicycle, Marion capturing the moment from behind the camera. And so they sat together, sharing stories as darkness gathered outside, building a bridge between their separate pasts. With each memory shared, each quiet laugh, each moment of understanding. The record player sat in the corner of the living room, a relic from another era that James kept mostly for sentiment's sake. Catherine discovered it while they were clearing space for the newly repaired furniture, her fingers trailing over its wooden cabinet with obvious recognition. "My father had one just like this," she said, carefully lifting the lid. "He used to play Frank Sinatra on Sunday mornings while he made pancakes." She glanced at James. "Does it still work?" James couldn't remember the last time he'd used it. Sarah had tried to give him a Bluetooth speaker last Christmas, insisting it was time to modernize. But some things weren't meant to be replaced. "Should," he said, moving to her side. "Marion's records are in the cabinet below." Catherine knelt to explore the collection, handling each album with reverence. "Oh," she breathed, pulling one out. "Nat King Cole. Unforgettable. My parents danced to this at their anniversary parties. The sun had set hours ago, and the living room was lit only by table lamps, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of everything." James watched as Catherine slid the record from its sleeve with practiced care, placing it on the turntable as if performing a ceremony. There was a moment of static, then the warm crackle of needle meeting vinyl, and finally, the rich, familiar notes filled the room. Catherine closed her eyes, swaying slightly to the music. "They don't make them like this anymore," she murmured. "The songs or the record players?" James asked, though he knew what she meant. There was something about the imperfect warmth of vinyl that digital music couldn't capture, like the difference between a handwritten letter and an email. "Both," she said, opening her eyes to look at him. "Everything's too perfect now, too processed. Sometimes you need the scratches and pops to remind you it's real." James thought about the carefully curated life she'd left behind in Chicago, about his own years of holding everything together so carefully that he'd almost forgotten how to let go. The music swelled around them, Nat King Cole's velvet voice, singing about unforgettable moments. "Would you like to dance?" The words surprised him, even as he spoke them. He hadn't danced since Sarah's wedding, and even then, it had been more duty than pleasure. Catherine's smile held a touch of vulnerability that made her look younger somehow. "I'd like that very much." She fit perfectly in his arms, as if they'd been dancing together for years instead of seconds. Her head came to rest just below his chin, and he could smell the light floral scent of her shampoo. She'd found it in Sarah's old bathroom, she'd told him earlier, apologizing for using it. He'd told her Sarah would like knowing it hadn't gone to waste. They moved together in small circles, nothing fancy, just the simple sway of two people finding their rhythm. Catherine's hand was warm in his, her other arm resting lightly on his shoulder. Through the window, stars were becoming visible in the clearing sky, and the grandfather clock kept quiet time with their movements. "I used to be terrible at this," Catherine confessed softly. "Richard hired a dance instructor before our wedding, said a CEO's wife needed to know proper ballroom technique." James pulled her a fraction closer. "This isn't proper ballroom technique." "No," She laughed quietly against his chest. "This is just dancing, the way people do when they're not trying to impress anyone." The song changed, another slow melody taking its place. Neither of them moved to part. James thought about all the dances he'd missed after Marion died, all the moments when having a partner would have made the step lighter, the music sweeter. "James." Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. Thank you for letting me stay, for sharing your home, your memories, for making me remember what it feels like to just be." He wanted to tell her that she'd brought something back, to the old house that he hadn't even realized was missing, that watching her work beside him, laugh at his terrible jokes, share stories over coffee, it had made him feel more alive than he had in years. Instead, he found himself tilting her, chin up gently with his free hand. Her eyes met his, full of questions and answers all at once. The music swelled around them, and in that moment everything else fell away. Their age, their past losses, the differences in their worlds. The kiss, when it came, felt as natural as breathing, soft, unhurried, carrying the weight of years of loneliness and the promise of something new. Catherine's hand tightened in his, and he drew her closer, their dance becoming something else entirely, as Nat King Cole sang about unforgettable love. The chirping of Catherine's cell phone broke through the morning quiet like a bird out of place. She'd finally gotten service back. The storm's passing had restored the connection to the world they'd briefly forgotten. James watched from the kitchen doorway as she stared at the screen, her face shifting from contentment to concern as messages flooded in. 27 voicemails, she murmured, setting her coffee cup down on the counter. 15 from my assistant alone. The elegant businesswoman he'd seen in the newspaper photo began to resurface in the way she straightened her shoulders, the subtle tightening around her eyes. "Anything urgent?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. They hadn't talked much. "About last night's kiss," both seeming to understand that morning light required a different kind of courage. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. Apparently, our largest client is threatening to pull their portfolio unless I return." Her fingers moved swiftly over the phone screen, composing responses. 3 billion in assets. Hundreds of jobs potentially affected. James nodded, turning back to the stove where breakfast was growing cold. He'd known this moment would come, the real world pressing in on their brief sanctuary. Still, the speed of its arrival felt like a physical thing, heavy and demanding. "James?" Catherine's voice held a note he hadn't heard before. Uncertainty, perhaps. "I need to make some calls. Would you mind?" "Take Sarah's old room upstairs," he said. "The reception's better up there." He didn't turn around, but he heard her soft footsteps on the stairs, followed by the gentle click of the door. Through the kitchen window, he could see the garden they'd worked on together yesterday. The rebuilt rose trellis stood ready for spring growth, a testament to possibilities. But now the morning sun cast longer shadows, and reality was creeping in with each message on Catherine's phone. Her voice drifted down from upstairs, muffled but professional. Gone was the warmth he'd held in his arms last night, replaced by crisp declarations about market projections and asset management. He caught phrases that meant nothing to him. Derivatives, hedge positions, board protocols, each one widening. The gap between their worlds. The grandfather clock struck 9, and James forced himself to move through his morning routine. There were repairs to finish, bills to sort through, his own reality to face. The bank's letter still sat unopened on his desk, its presence a reminder that romantic interludes didn't pay mortgages. When Catherine finally came downstairs, she'd somehow managed to transform herself even in borrowed clothes. Her hair was neatly arranged, her posture impeccable. Only the fading bruise on her knee from yesterday's garden work betrayed the other woman he'd come to know. "I've arranged for a car," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "It should be here in a few hours. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. In Chicago, and there's a lot to prepare." James nodded, focusing on wiping down the already clean counter. "Of course, you have responsibilities, James." The way she said his name made him look up. She stood in the doorway, her phone clutched, in one hand like a shield. "Last night was lovely," he finished for her, offering the kind of smile he'd perfected over years of letting go. But we both knew this wasn't permanent. Catherine took a step toward him, then stopped as her phone chirped again. The sound hung between them like an accusation. "It's not that simple," she said, and he could hear the CEO wrestling with the woman who danced with him in the firelight. "Isn't it?" He gestured to her phone. "That's your real-life calling. 3 billion. In assets, you said. Hundreds of jobs. Against what? A broken-down farmhouse and a man who can barely keep up with his mortgage. Don't." Her voice sharpened. "Don't diminish what happened here. What's happening here?" "And what is happening here, Catherine? A few days of playing at a simpler life? Some romantic notion of escaping the corporate world?" The words tasted bitter, but he forced them out anyway. Better to lance the wound quickly. She moved then, closing the distance between them with determined steps. Her phone clattered onto the counter as she took his face in her hands. "Look at me," she demanded. "Really look. Do I seem like someone?" And playing at anything? Her eyes held his, and in them he saw the same war he was fighting, between duty and desire, between the lives they'd built and the life they'd glimpsed together. The morning sun streamed through the window, painting them, both in unforgiving clarity as her phone chirped again, insistent as a conscience. The knock came, just as Catherine was upstairs packing her borrowed clothes. James knew that particular rhythm, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones, Sarah's signature knock since high school. Through the front door's beveled glass, he could make out 2 figures, and his heart sank. Of course she'd bring Daniel. Of course it would be today. He opened the door to find his daughter clutching a familiar frame, the crayon drawing she'd made in 1st grade, the one that had hung in his office all those years. A stick-figure family standing before a yellow house, everyone holding hands and smiling impossible smiles. Surprise! Sarah's grin faded as she read his expression. "Dad? What's wrong? We saw the storm damage on the news. Tried calling, but couldn't get through." "I'm fine," he started, but footsteps on the stairs behind him made Sarah's eyes widen. Catherine appeared in the hallway, wearing Sarah's old University of Washington sweatshirt, her silver-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. "Oh," Sarah said, the single syllable carrying volumes. Daniel, ever diplomatic, suddenly became very interested in the porch railings. "Sarah," James managed, "this is Catherine. She got caught in the storm, needed a place to wait it out." The explanation sounded thin, even to his ears, too simple to capture the complexity of the past few days. "Catherine Morgan?" Sarah's journalist instincts kicked in, her eyes narrowing. "The Catherine Morgan from Chicago? The investment firm CEO?" Catherine stepped forward, her presence somehow both graceful and apologetic. "Former CEO, actually, though I'm beginning to question that decision given recent developments." She glanced at James, a world of unspoken meaning passing between them. Sarah's grip on the picture frame tightened. "Dad, can we talk? Privately?" The kitchen had always been their place for serious conversations. As Sarah set the old drawing on the counter, James noticed how the colors had faded over the years. The yellow house now more cream, the blue sky softened to pearl. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah asked without preamble. "And why didn't you tell me?" "There's nothing to tell," James said, but the words rang false. "Her car broke down during the storm. I offered shelter. She's leaving today." "Really?" Sarah's tone was gentle now, concerned rather than accusatory. "Because I saw how you looked at each other just now." "I'm a reporter, Dad. I notice things." James sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly tired. "Sarah, honey." "No, let me finish." She pulled out another chair, sat close enough to take his hand. "I've been worried about you, all alone out here. Every time I visit, this house feels more like a museum of memories than a home. And now, for the first time in years, I walk in and it feels alive." "It's complicated," he said, the understatement of it almost making him laugh. "Life usually is." Sarah reached for the drawing, traced the stick-figure family with one finger. Remember when I made this? You'd just taught me about perspective in drawing, why the house needed to be bigger than the people. But I insisted on making us all the same size because I said love makes everyone equal. James felt his throat tighten. You were always too wise for your age. I learned from you, she said softly. You taught me that love matters more than money, that character outweighs status. So why are you letting those things stand in your way now? Through the kitchen window, they could see Catherine and Daniel in the garden, her giving him a tour of their repair work, while he nodded appreciatively. Even from here, James could see how she brightened when speaking about the roses. She has responsibilities, he said. A life in Chicago, people depending on her. And you have responsibilities too, Sarah agreed. To yourself, to your own happiness. She turned the drawing toward him. Look at this house, Dad. Look how happy we were even after Mom died, even when money was tight. Because you taught me that home isn't about the building, it's about the love inside it. James watched Catherine laugh at something Daniel said, the sound carrying through the morning air. When did you get so smart about relationships? Well, Sarah smiled. I had a pretty good example of what real love looks like. Mom would want you to be happy, Dad. She told me that once, near the end, made me promise to remind you someday. The child's drawing sat between them, its faded colors still speaking of hope and possibility, of a little girl's understanding that love makes everyone equal. Outside, Catherine turned toward the house, her eyes finding his through the window with unerring accuracy, and James felt something in his chest expand, like a flower opening to the sun. 2 train tickets lay on the kitchen table between them, the evening sun turning their edges golden. Chicago to Prairie Falls, round trip, dated 2 weeks from today. Catherine had placed them there without ceremony after Sarah and Daniel had left after the car she'd arranged had come and gone without her in it. I rescheduled the board meeting, she said quietly, watching James's face as he stared at the tickets. Told them I needed 2 more weeks to prepare a proper transition plan. She paused, then added, and to figure out what I really want. James touched one of the tickets, feeling the smooth cardstock under his weathered fingers. Catherine, let me finish, she said, her voice carrying the same authority she must have used in countless boardrooms, but softened now with something more vulnerable. I've spent my entire adult life making decisions based on spreadsheets and profit margins, but these past few days, working beside you, sharing meals, even fixing that garden fence, I've felt more authentic than I have in 30 years. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background as James considered her words. Outside, the evening light painted long shadows across their newly repaired garden. It's not that simple, he said finally. No, it isn't, Catherine agreed. Nothing worth having ever is. She reached across the table, her hand covering his where it still rested on the ticket. That's why I bought round-trip tickets. 2 weeks. Time for both of us to be sure. And what happens in those 2 weeks? I go back to Chicago. Handle what needs handling. But I come back here first, to you, to this. She gestured around them, encompassing the kitchen with its worn counters and history-laden walls. And we see if what we've found here is strong enough to build a future on. James thought about Sarah's words earlier, about Marion's blessing passed down through their daughter. He thought about mornings waking up alone, about conversations with the grandfather clock, about how differently the old house felt with Catherine in it. Your work, he started, can be done from anywhere if I restructure things properly. Her fingers laced through his. I've spent the afternoon on calls with my legal team. The firm doesn't need a CEO who sits in Chicago watching numbers scroll across screens. It needs leadership that understands value isn't just about profit margins. And the house, he had to ask, had to lay all the practical concerns between them like cards on the table. The mortgage is one of many things we can figure out together, she cut in firmly. I'm not offering to sweep in and solve everything with money, James. That's not what either of us wants. I'm offering partnership, like the kind you and Marion had. the kind where two people face challenges together and find solutions that honor both their needs. The train tickets caught another ray of setting sun, glowing like promises. James thought about the tool belt they'd shared, about Catherine's hands learning the texture of work alongside his, about how naturally she'd fit into the rhythm of his days. 2 weeks is a long time, he said finally. Catherine's smile held understanding. Long enough to be sure, long enough for both of us to know this isn't just some romantic fantasy about escaping to a simpler life or finding comfort in a storm. She squeezed his hand. Long enough to miss each other. The evening had deepened around them as they talked, shadows gathering in the corners of the kitchen. James stood, pulling Catherine up with him, needing suddenly to hold her, to feel the solid reality of her presence while they still had these moments. She came into his arms easily, her head finding that perfect spot beneath his chin. "I'm scared too," she whispered against his chest. "Terrified, actually. I've never done anything this unscripted." James chuckled, the sound rumbling between them. "And I've never dated a CEO. Former CEO," she corrected, leaning back to look at him. "Currently considering a career change to small-town renovations specialist. I hear there's a promising partnership opportunity with a local contractor." The joke landed exactly as intended, breaking the tension without diminishing the importance of the moment. James touched her face, tracing the laugh lines that matched his own. 2 weeks? 2 weeks, she confirmed. Just long enough to be sure, not long enough to talk ourselves out of something real. The train tickets lay forgotten on the table, as they sealed their agreement with a kiss that felt both like an ending and a beginning. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, while inside, the grandfather clock marked time with peaceful certainty, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The house keys lay heavy in James's palm, 3 generations of MacPherson history reduced to cold metal and brass. His grandfather's key to the front door, worn smooth by decades of use. His father's key to the barn, its teeth still sharp despite the years. And his own key, the one had made the day he'd moved Marion into this house, promising her a future they'd never get to share. 2 weeks had passed like water through his fingers. Catherine's daily calls had become the framework of his evenings. Her voice carrying stories of Chicago boardrooms and legal meetings, while he shared tales of garden progress and local gossip. But it was the silences between their words that told the real story, the comfortable pauses that felt like home. Now, on the morning she was due to return, he found himself walking through the house, touching door frames and window sills, remembering Sarah's height marks penciled on the kitchen doorframe, the loose floorboard in the hallway that had squeaked through midnight feedings and teenage sneaking, the wall where Marion had insisted on hanging that crooked shelf he'd made in high school woodshop. His phone buzzed, a text from Catherine. Her train was on time, 2 hours away. The keys clinked together as his hand tightened around them, and he thought about the conversation they'd had last night. "I've got it all arranged," she'd said, her voice warm through the phone line. "The boards approved my proposal for remote leadership. I'll need to travel to Chicago monthly for meetings, but otherwise, I can run things from anywhere with good internet." "And you're sure?" he'd asked, needing to hear it one more time. "About all of it?" "James," she'd said, and he could hear her smile. "I've spent 2 weeks in meetings with some of the sharpest minds in corporate America. Know what I kept thinking about? That garden fence we fixed. The satisfaction of standing back and seeing something real we'd built together." He moved to the living room now, where the grandfather clock stood sentinel. On the mantel, he'd gathered photos that tracked his life's journey. Marion on their wedding day, Sarah's graduation. And now, propped between them, a new addition. A snapshot Daniel had taken of him and Catherine in the garden, both of them dirt-smudged and laughing, the rose trellis rising behind them like a promise. The bank letter that had worried him for so long lay opened on his desk, but its threats held less power now. Catherine had been clear. She wasn't offering charity but partnership. They'd find a way to make things work that preserved his dignity while acknowledging their shared future. "Love makes everyone equal," Sarah had reminded him, quoting her childhood wisdom. His phone buzzed again. "Sarah, this time. Stop overthinking it, Dad. Trust your heart for once." The keys caught the morning light, throwing shadows on the wall. He thought about Catherine's corporate life in Chicago, the world she was willing to reshape for this chance at something real. The least he could do was show equal courage. Moving with sudden purpose, he went to his toolbox and pulled out the spare key he'd had made last week. New brass, not yet worn by time and use, a beginning rather than an inheritance. He added it to the ring with the others, watching how it gleamed against their patina. Inside his closet, a small duffel bag waited. Enough clothes for a few days. In Chicago, where Catherine had asked him to come see her world, meet her people, understand the life she was choosing to reshape. "Partnership goes both ways," she'd said. The sound of tires on gravel brought him to the front window. Pete Martinez's taxi, right on time, ready to take him to the train station where he'd meet Catherine's incoming train and board the outbound with her. His heart hammered against his ribs like a teenage boy's, though his grey hair in the mirror told a different story. He took one last look around the living room, at the walls that had held his history. But for the first time in 20 years, they didn't feel like a museum of memories. Instead, they seemed to pulse with possibility, as if the house itself was ready for its next chapter. The keys chimed softly as he lifted them, testing their weight one final time. Then he stepped onto the porch, locking the door behind him, with the familiar keys and the one new one that pointed toward future mornings, future gardens, future laughter. In his pocket, Catherine's ticket to Chicago pressed against his heart like a map to somewhere they'd discover together. The moving boxes scattered around Catherine's Chicago penthouse told their own story of transformation. Some were marked for storage, others for donation, and a select few labeled Prairie Falls in Catherine's elegant handwriting contained the carefully chosen pieces of her old life she wanted to blend into their new one. James stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over a cityscape that felt like another world. Behind him, Catherine moved between boxes with purposeful energy, sorting through the artifacts of her corporate life with the same efficiency she'd once applied to merger negotiations. "The art collection goes to the Chicago Museum," she was saying, her voice carrying from the other room. "Except for this one." She emerged carrying a small, worn landscape painting, its frame scratched but well-loved. "My grandfather painted this. It's of the barn we rebuilt that summer." James crossed to take it from her, studying the brushstrokes that captured a simpler time. "We'll hang it in the study," he said, and watched her face light up at the casual "will" at how naturally they'd begun to speak in shared futures. The week in Chicago had been eye-opening for them both. He'd watched Catherine navigate board meetings with grace and authority, restructuring her role with the same careful attention she'd given to rebuilding his garden fence. She'd shown him her world without pretense, and he'd surprised himself by feeling not intimidated but proud of her success, and prouder still of her courage to choose happiness over empire. "The realtor called," Catherine said, settling beside him at the window. "She's found several properties near our home, small office buildings we could renovate, perfect for a satellite office and local business investment." James smiled at her self-correction, at how she was already thinking of his house as their home. Planning to transform Prairie Falls into a corporate hub, more like investing in its future, our future. She leaned against him, comfortable in the charcoal sweater and jeans she'd taken to wearing instead of power suits. Small business loans, local development projects, things that build community, not just profits. A stack of papers on her desk caught his eye, building permits and contractor licenses for Montana. She'd been quietly laying groundwork, finding ways to combine their skills and dreams. The moving boxes around them seemed less like endings and more like seeds of something new. "Sarah called while you were in the shower," James said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Says she's lined up 3 restoration projects for us already. Seems word got out that Prairie Falls is getting its own power couple." Catherine laughed, the sound echoing off the penthouse's bare walls. Most of her furniture had already been donated, leaving the space feeling like a chrysalis they were slowly emerging from. "Power couple? Is that what we are? Well, you're the power, I'm just along for the ride." She turned in his arms, fixing him with the same look she'd probably used on countless boardroom doubters. "James MacPherson, you rebuilt an entire life from scratch while raising a daughter alone. You've kept your integrity through every hardship. Don't sell yourself short." His response was interrupted by the arrival of the moving crew. They worked together through the afternoon, directing which boxes went where, their teamwork as natural here as it had been in the garden. Each decision felt like another step toward their shared vision. As sunset painted the Chicago skyline in shades of gold, they stood amid the organized chaos of their transition. Catherine's laptop sat open on a box, displaying renovation plans for the old Parker building in Prairie Falls, their first joint project. Beside it lay sketches for the garden expansion she'd proposed, combining her business acumen with his practical knowledge to create something neither could have managed alone. "Having second thoughts?" James asked softly, watching her take in the half-empty apartment that had been her home for so many years. Catherine picked up the small landscape painting, running her fingers along its frame. "About leaving this?" She gestured at the pristine skyline. "No, but I'm having 20th thoughts about where to plant those heritage roses I ordered, the ones your mother-in-law originally planted." Her casual reference to Marion, her understanding of the garden's history, made James's heart swell. She wasn't trying to replace the past, but to honor it while building something new. The moving boxes around them weren't just containing possessions. They were carrying possibilities. "The west fence," he said decisively. "Morning sun, afternoon shade, perfect for roses." Catherine's smile was brighter than the sunset behind her. "See? Power couple." Together, they watched darkness creep over Chicago, while in their minds, they were already home in Prairie Falls, planning tomorrow's garden. The old recipe book lay open on the kitchen counter, its pages spotted with decades of loving use. Marion's handwriting filled the margins with notes. "More butter. Sarah loves this with extra cinnamon. James prefers honey to sugar." Catherine ran her fingers over the faded ink, adding her own note to a bread recipe. "Try with rosemary from garden." 6 months into their new life together, the house had become a reflection of their merged worlds. Catherine's elegant copper pots hung alongside James's well-seasoned cast iron. Her laptop shared desk space with his hand-drawn renovation plans. The garden bloomed with a combination of Marion's heritage roses and Catherine's experimental hybrid. "Oh, tea varieties. I think I've finally cracked your mother's pie crust recipe," Catherine called out as James came in from the workshop, sawdust clinging to his clothes. The secret was in that tiny note about ice water temperature. He paused to kiss her flour-dusted cheek, marveling at how natural it felt, this domestic dance they'd created. "Marion would have loved teaching you," he said. "She believed recipes were meant to be shared, improved upon." Catherine smiled, adding another note to the margin. "Like Sarah's suggestion about using vodka for flakiness? I had my doubts, but she was right." She checked the oven timer. "Speaking of Sarah, she and Daniel will be here tomorrow. First ultrasound photos to share." The news of Sarah's pregnancy had come 2 months ago, and with it, a shift in their family dynamic. Catherine had thrown herself into grandmother preparations with the same thoroughness she'd once applied to corporate takeovers. The spare room was slowly transforming into a nursery, complete with a rocking chair James was crafting from local maple. "The Parker building renovation is ahead of schedule," Catherine said, wiping her hands on her apron. "A gift from the ladies' auxiliary, after she'd won second place in the county fair's pie contest." Marie at the bank says 3 more businesses have applied for our small business development loans. James settled at the kitchen table watching her work. She moved through their kitchen with the same confidence she displayed in board meetings, which she now conducted via video call from their newly renovated home office. The satellite office in town employed 6 people focusing on local investment and community development. Martha Reynolds stopped by the site today, he said, accepting the coffee she handed him. Says her daughter's interested in apprenticing with us this summer, wants to learn restoration carpentry. Perfect timing, with the Miller House project coming up. Catherine checked something in the recipe book. We should have her over for dinner, talk about the apprenticeship program we've been planning. The "we" still gave James a warm feeling. They'd found a rhythm in their work as natural as their life together. Catherine's business acumen complemented his practical knowledge, creating a partnership that was revitalizing not just their lives, but the whole town. She joined him at the table, bringing the recipe book with her. I've been thinking, she said, turning to a blank page at the back. We should start our own section, new recipes for our expanding family. James watched as she wrote Catherine and James at the top of the page, her elegant handwriting a contrast to Marian's homey script. Below it, she added, family favorites next generation. Sarah asked for your cornbread recipe, she continued. Says Daniel's been craving it. Pregnancy sympathies, apparently. She laughed softly. I told her she'd have to come apprentice in the kitchen, learn it properly like I did. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the silver in both their hair, warming the kitchen that had become the heart of their blended life. Outside, the garden waited for spring planting, and the workshop held half-finished furniture for their growing family. First entry? James asked, nodding at the blank page. Catherine dipped her pen in ink. She insisted proper recipe books needed proper penmanship. I was thinking we could start with that rosemary bread, the one we created together. She began writing, reading, aloud as she went. Grandpa James's and Grandma Catherine's Sunday morning rosemary bread. The title hit him softly, a gentle recognition of their evolving roles. Soon there would be a little one calling them those names, learning to bake in this kitchen, playing in the garden they'd rebuilt together. Perfect, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Catherine reached for his hand, leaving a trace of flour on his skin. Together they began dictating their recipe, creating something new from the foundations of tradition, just as they had with everything else in their shared life. The simple gold band caught the evening light as James turned it over in his palm. No diamonds, no elaborate settings, just a plain circle of gold that had belonged to his grandmother. He'd found it that morning while searching through the attic, for Sarah's old baby blanket tucked away in a box of family mementos. Catherine was in the garden, tending to the roses that had flourished under her care. Through the kitchen window, he could see her talking to the plants as she worked, a habit she'd picked up from him. She'd just returned from her monthly trip to Chicago, and somehow the house felt more like home each time she came back. They hadn't talked about marriage. At their age, with their histories, it had seemed unnecessary. They'd built a life together over the past 8 months that felt more solid than any legal document could make it. The Parker building renovation was nearly complete. Their small business initiative was transforming the town, and Sarah's baby was due in 4 months. Yet holding his grandmother's ring, James felt the rightness of it. Not from obligation or tradition, but from a quiet certainty that had grown alongside their garden. He slipped the ring into his pocket and headed outside. Catherine looked up as he approached, brushing dirt from her knees. She'd been deadheading the late summer roses, preparing them for their final bloom before autumn. A smudge of soil marked her cheek, and her gardening hat, a ridiculous wide-brimmed thing they'd found at a local flea market, cast dappled shadows across her face. The yellow roses are coming along beautifully, she said, reaching for his hand to help her up. Sarah was right about the bone meal fertilizer. She paused, noting his expression. James, what is it? He led her to the bench they'd placed beneath the maple tree, the one he'd built during their first month together. It had become their favorite spot for evening conversations, watching the sun set over their shared domain. "I found something. In the attic today," he began, then stopped. All the words he'd planned seemed suddenly inadequate. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. Catherine's breath caught, her hand finding his arm. "Oh," she said softly. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "She gave it to my grandfather when they'd been working their farm together for almost a year. Said she figured if they could survive 4 seasons of drought and broken equipment, without killing each other, marriage would be easy." A smile tugged at Catherine's lips. "Wise woman." "Thing is," James continued, his thumb running over the smooth gold band, "I've been thinking about what marriage means at our age. It's not about starting a life together, we've done that. It's not about proving anything to anyone, it's just recognition of what already is." Catherine's hand tightened on his arm. "Recognition," she repeated thoughtfully. "When Sarah told us about the baby, you immediately became Grandma Catherine in everyone's minds. The town considers us a unit. The business operates under both. Our names," he turned to face her fully, "but mostly I want to stand up in front of our family, our friends, and say what we've known since that first storm brought you to my door." "And what's that?" Her voice was tender, encouraging, that love doesn't end with one chapter, that sometimes life gives you a second chance at happiness if you're brave enough to take it. He held out the ring. "That I love you, Catherine Morgan, and I'd be honored to add you officially to the MacPherson family recipe book." She laughed at that, even as tears gathered in her eyes. "You know, I had a whole team of lawyers once negotiate a $3 billion merger, and it didn't feel half as momentous as this moment." "Is that a yes?" James asked, his heart hammering against his ribs like a teenager's. Catherine held out her left hand. "That's a what took you so long?" As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she added, "I love you too, James MacPherson. And I would very much like to be officially added to that recipe book." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. They sat together on their bench as evening settled around them, Catherine's head on his shoulder, their hands intertwined. The roses released their evening fragrance, and somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill called. "Small ceremony," Catherine said after a while. "Here in the garden, just family and close friends. Sarah will want to help plan it," James noted. "Though she'll have to waddle down the aisle as our matron of honor." "Perfect," Catherine smiled. "A celebration of what is, what was, and what's coming." She twisted the ring on her finger, watching it catch the last rays of sunset. "Your grandmother would approve, I think." "She would," James agreed, pulling her closer. "She always said, the best marriages grow like gardens, with patience, care, and a willingness to get your hands dirty." The new family portrait sat on an easel in the garden, surrounded by autumn roses and late-blooming asters. Taken just hours ago, it captured a moment that seemed both impossible and inevitable. James and Catherine standing beneath the maple tree, its leaves turned golden above them. Sarah seated nearby in a chair crafted by her father, her 8-month pregnancy evident beneath her flowing dress. Daniel stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, while members of the town gathered around them like a living frame. "Perfect timing," Catherine said, adjusting the portrait's position slightly. The wedding guests had gone home, leaving just family in the twilight garden. The baby waited for the wedding, and now we're all here together. James watched his wife, the words still new and wonderful as she fussed with the photograph. She wore a simple blue dress that matched the autumn sky, a crown of roses from their garden in her silver hair. No white gown, no elaborate ceremony, just truth, spoken in front of those they loved, in the garden they'd rebuilt together. "Mom would have loved this," Sarah said from her chair, both hands resting on her rounded belly. "All of it. The garden wedding, the roses everywhere, the way the whole town showed up even though you insisted on keeping it small." "Small is relative in Prairie Falls," Catherine laughed, coming to sit beside her stepdaughter, "though I suspect the promise of my chocolate bourbon pecan pie might have inflated the guest list." The recipe for that pie now had its own page in the family cookbook, Catherine's elegant handwriting noting that it had won first place at this year's county fair. The ladies' auxiliary had finally stopped testing her, accepting that the CEO from Chicago had become one of their own. "Did you see Mrs. Henderson crying during the vows?" Daniel asked, bringing over cups of decaf coffee, Sarah's doctor mandated restriction that the whole family had adopted in solidarity. "Right when you mentioned the storm that brought you together. Grace Henderson cries at everything," James said fondly, accepting a cup. "But she also wrote the letter to the bank that convinced them our small business initiative was worth backing." Catherine reached for his hand, her grandmother's ring catching the evening light. "This whole town, they've become family. When the Parker building opens next week, did you see how many local artisans have already signed up for spaces? And how many of them insisted on paying above market rate for their leases?" Sarah added, wincing slightly as the baby kicked. "They want to invest in what you're building here." The portrait seemed to glow in the fading light, capturing not just their faces, but the story of their unlikely family. The photographer had suggested poses in front of the house, but Catherine had insisted on the garden. "This is where we really began," she'd said, "among the roses and broken fences." James studied the image, seeing beyond the surface to the layers of meaning. The garden they'd restored together, the maple tree that had weathered storms and seasons, Sarah carrying the next generation of their blended family. Even the Parker building was visible in the background, its renovated facade a testament to their shared vision for the town's future. "Oh!" Sarah's sudden exclamation drew everyone's attention. She pressed a hand to her side, then smiled. "Someone's celebrating with a dance party." Catherine moved to feel the baby's movements, her face lighting up at each kick. The moment struck James with its perfection, his daughter and his wife, the past and present flowing together, while future possibilities tumbled beneath Sarah's heart. "I have something for you both," Sarah said, reaching for her bag. She pulled out a small wrapped package. "Well, for all of us, really." Inside was a new photo album, its leather cover tooled with roses. On the first page, Sarah had written, "The MacPherson family new chapters," in her journalist's precise hand. Below that was today's date, and space for the wedding portrait to be added. "For the next generation of stories," Sarah explained, her eyes bright with tears she blamed on pregnancy hormones. "So your grandchild will know how love can bloom in the most unexpected storms." Catherine's hand found James's again as they looked through the album's empty pages, each one waiting to be filled with moments yet to come. The garden around them settled into evening, crickets beginning their night song. From somewhere nearby came the familiar chime of the grandfather clock, marking time's passage with the same steady grace that had witnessed their beginning. "New chapters," James repeated softly, holding his wife closer as their daughter leaned against her husband. The family portrait watching over them all like a promise kept and renewed. The garden bench, weathered by a year of seasons, held James and Catherine in the soft light of another Montana evening. Baby Emma slept peacefully in Catherine's arms, her tiny fingers curled around her grandmother's pearl necklace. At 3 months old, she already showed signs of the MacPherson determination, evident in the way she fought sleep even now, her rosebud lips twitching with dream-fed smiles. "She has Marion's nose," James said softly, touching his granddaughter's cheek, "and Sarah's chin. And your stubbornness," Catherine added with a gentle laugh, though Sarah swears that comes from both sides of the family. The garden had bloomed extraordinarily this year, as if celebrating Emma's arrival. Marion's heritage roses twined with Catherine's new varieties, creating a legacy of beauty that would greet their granddaughter's first steps, first words, first adventures. The maple tree above them cast dappled shadows on the stone path they'd laid together, its branches stretching toward tomorrow. In town, the Parker building hummed with activity, its shops and offices bringing new life to Prairie Falls. There, Small business initiative had grown beyond their initial dreams, spawning similar programs in neighboring communities. Catherine managed it all from their home office, her corporate expertise now focused on building something lasting for Emma's generation. "Did you ever imagine this?" Catherine asked, adjusting the sleeping baby. "That night when I knocked on your door in the storm?" James smiled, remembering the rain, the broken car key, the way Catherine had looked in borrowed clothes. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "But now I can't imagine any other way it could have turned out." Sarah and Daniel had bought the old Miller house just down the road, close enough for daily visits, but far enough for privacy. They'd insisted on hiring James and Catherine's company for the renovation, paying full price despite family protests. "It's an investment in the future," Sarah had said, already planning the garden she would plant for Emma. The grandfather clock chimed from inside the house, its familiar voice carrying across years of memories. Catherine had learned to wind it properly, treating it with the same respect she showed all the house's history. In return, the old home had embraced her completely, its rooms warming with the sound of her laughter, its walls holding space for new stories alongside the old. Emma stirred, yawning widely before settling back to sleep. Above her, the evening star appeared, bright and steady in the deepening blue. James wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders, marveling at how perfectly she fit there, how right this all felt. "You know what Emma's arrival reminds me of," Catherine said, leaning into him. "That quote about love making everyone equal. Sarah's childhood wisdom." James nodded, watching the roses sway in the evening breeze. Love had indeed leveled all the walls between their worlds. Corporate success and small-town values, past grief and present joy, old memories and new beginnings. In their garden, on their bench, holding their granddaughter, they were simply family. "Speaking of wisdom," he said, "I believe someone promised me another slice of that award-winning pecan pie." Catherine's laugh was soft, mindful of the sleeping baby. "Later," she promised. "Right now, this moment is perfect exactly as it is." And it was. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by roses and memories and possibilities, they sat together on their bench, watching night settle over their garden like a blessing.